Thank you, everybody, for coming to this event, Kickstarting the Next Baby Boom. We're delighted to have a fantastic panel who I'll introduce. So this is a joint event between Civic Future and Boom. And for those who don't know, Civic Future identifies and trains the next generation of public leaders. So we have a fellowship. So please look up our fellowship on the website. And it is a program for early to mid-career young people from a range of backgrounds. And we train them over a year in the big philosophical, political and technological challenges of the day. We also have an annual conference. I think some people in attendance might have been there, where we bring together experts and decision makers around a really big question of our time. We did one on economic stagnation, recently geopolitics. And we also have a range of public and private events. And these are one of the events that we do, public events, which try and engage and the public discussion. It may be things that are not necessarily being discussed. And we bring together very interesting people with lots of perspectives on this issue. And Boom is a fantastic organisation that describes itself as enabling people or supporting people to make choosing to have a child easier for everybody. And one of the co-founders is on the panel today, and I'm sure that she'll be talking about some of the work of Boom and many of the arguments that they make. So I will introduce our fantastic panel. And our panel is Phoebe Arslanagić-Little. She is the director of Boom. We are sadly no longer going to be joined by Stephen Bush. He's come under the weather, so he can't join us, I'm afraid. But we also have Ruxandra Teslo, who is a cultural commentator, author, and PhD student in Genomics at the Sanger Institute. And she also has a really interesting and fantastic Substack, which is growing in influence. And we also have Aveek Bhattacharya, who is economist and research director at the social market think tank. So we're doing this discussion because it has been, rising in prominence. Questions about childcare, family policy, how it's difficult for the younger generations as it was before. And there's lots of different interventions that different countries have done with a range of success. But there is still often a lot of stigma around, countries being quite proactive in this area, but it is an issue that particularly young people really care about. So we are going to look at the different things that people have done, what success they have had, and why it's important. So we will start with you, Phoebe.
Thank you, Anaya, and thank you to Civic Future for doing this with us. Good evening, everyone. It's really brilliant to see you all here. I've been looking forward to this for weeks. So I'm Phoebe. I work exclusively on the birth rate challenge. And I want to start by telling you about two things that I believe. One, no surprise to many of you, I believe that falling birth rates are a real problem for our society and economy. Economically, we are caught in the pincer of two powerful factors. As fertility falls and lifespans increase, the working age population shrinks. An older population is one that requires much support. Spending on state pension, adult social care, health spending, that's going to account for 50% of UK government spending in 2070, if not sooner, actually, because that's an OBR projection. So it's actually surprisingly optimistic. And our social security system was created at a time when our population pyramid looked very, very different. Not the inverted pyramid that we are now moving towards. And that means an ever-increasing tax burden on those who are working, threatens the integrity and viability of our social security system, harms economic growth. It severely curtails our ability to even care for that older population. And there is increasing consensus that's been building for years, but is now coming together, I'm pleased to say, much more rapidly, that falling birth rates are a real problem for us. And I suspect most people in this room, though perhaps not everyone, would agree with me. But here's the second thing I believe. I believe it is a problem that we can solve. The evidence is telling us that there are policies that are absolutely within the gift of government that can improve birth rates. Policies that are very crucially not about lobbying people to have children, policies that are about helping people to do something that they already want to do, start families. There are many fascinating and hopeful case studies, but let's talk about France. Today, French women have more children than those in any other European country. It's not just cultural. The French side of the Franco-Spanish border has high fertility. The French side of the Franco-Italian border has high fertility. That's despite the fact these are actually very culturally similar areas with historically liquid borders. Yet France is distinctly higher fertility. Have French people simply always had more children than other Europeans? No. For decades, from 1800 all the way up to the 1920s, France was very much the demographic sick man of Europe. French intellectuals and academics thought that France was going to disappear. You'll notice it hasn't. So what changed? French women have more children today than those in any other European country because of intentional government policy. Policies that were introduced first in the 1920s, but really expanded in the 1940s. A very family-friendly tax system, single-parent cash benefits, pre-birth cash grants, non-means-tested benefits for families with 2 children, more non-means-tested benefits for families with 3 children, strong employment protections for parents, childcare support, housing support for young families. I could go on. Today, France spends 3.5% of its GDP on family benefits. And their reward for that is a birth rate that is durably higher. Demographers estimate that over the past 100 years, 0.1 to 0.3 of the French total fertility rate is down to those policies. And others would argue that's actually pretty conservative. Over time, these differences that sound kind of small, they really add up. If we consider what it would look like if 100 French people at the French total fertility rate of 1.68, their children and their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, those 100 people would have 59 great-grandchildren between them. We have 100 Spanish people with a total fertility rate of 1.21. They only have 22 great-grandchildren between them. As I say, these differences, they really add up over the generations. The policy choices that France has made and maintained are responsible literally for millions of French people alive today. When Keir Starmer was asked about falling birth rates in Washington, D.C. Last month, he waved the question away. He said he did not want to dictate to people how many children they should have. And what I want to get across to politicians like Keir Starmer and many others is that there is no need to dictate anything to anyone in this policy area. Instead, at Boom, what we believe that we need to do is to take the needs of parents and prospective parents very, very seriously. Employed new mothers on maternity leave get just 6 weeks of payments at 90% of their average weekly earnings, and then just £185 a week for the next 33 weeks. Statutory paternity leave is just 2 weeks. I'm pregnant, but I have my baby in December. My husband is only going to get 2 weeks. Scarcely enough time to even realise that he's had a child, let alone give me all the support that I'm doubtless going to need. We don't have non-means-tested child benefits. Our hospital maternity care is poor, and we know that people are having fewer children than they want. Better employment protections, a tax system that recognises children. These are prosaic policies, but I really do think that they could change everything for us. And if we make it easier to start and raise a family, we will also have positive cultural effects. Ruxandra's going to be talking a lot about culture, I know. And in making it easier to be a parent, we can help create, through policy, a self-propelling positive culture of parenthood. A UK where having a first child or another child feels supported, encouraged, achieved. That's what the evidence is telling us. I think that's how you kickstart a new baby boom, and that's what I want as many of you as possible to go away thinking about tonight. Thank you.
So we will come back to many of those points. Just quickly, there is a few seats at the front there, so people at the back, there's about 4 or 5 if you would like to sit at the front. So we'll now move over to you, Ruxandra.
Hi everyone. So as Inaya just said, I'm a PhD student in genomics, so I'm a scientist. That's my official title. And unofficially, but very kindly, Phoebe also called me a cultural commentator, whatever that means. And so today I'm going to be talking about science and culture. And I think what Phoebe said was very interesting, that you can have a positive feedback loop between culture and policy, and I totally agree with that. But I think we need to think about both. You know, like we can't just say, oh, we should improve policy and then just leave culture aside. I think what, the observation about Keir Starmer, who said that I don't want to force anyone to have more kids and so on, is very telling in this regard. It's very telling about the fact that we do have an anti-natalist culture, and associating yourself with natalist beliefs is sort of seen as a bit shady, suspicious. So my point is that if you want to propose policies that are popular with the explicit aim of being natalist, it is important to do so on the background of a culture that recognizes the importance of children. So why do I say that culture is anti-natalist? Of course, I have a lot of anecdotal evidence, which in many ways I trust better, but I also have a lot of data. So Pew Research Center, for example, when they interviewed especially young people, only 25% of them say they think family and like having kids is a key to fulfillment. The top thing that they said will bring fulfillment is career. Now, what is interesting is that when you interview people with children, which is the majority of people still, so it's not like entirely a sampling issue here, they say that having children is the most fulfilling thing that they did, not career. So they find having children much more fulfilling. Now, there's a lot of problems with these surveys, and like you can't trust this completely, but I do think it points to a divergence about what we say is good and what people sometimes find to be good for themselves. And in many ways, but then what is interesting is when you ask people with children what they want from their children, they will also say that they want their children to have super high-powered career above children. So these are people that know that having children is very fulfilling, but then they say, no, for my children, I want them to have career first and foremost. And the reason I think for that is I think this shows the importance of what we place high status on as a culture. And obviously, I also have a lot of anecdotal evidence, like someone who works in a very sort of, classically like university people with university studies, high-powered, so on, institute, like there's like, it's not like people are anti-nihilist anywhere, but like I think there's some sort of like, you don't talk about these things explicitly because it's maybe tinted with a bit of like weirdness and like maybe people feel forced. It's almost like the opposite of the grandmother that comes to you and is like, when are you having a kid? It's like, don't have a kid. And so I think that how can we change that? Because I think it's important to change that. So we are doing kind of this now, talking to people, promoting the importance of children is very important. Each one of us, of course, this is like a very decentralized process, so it won't happen overnight. Now, I do think that there are some real obstacles that have to be acknowledged and which are at the root of why people feel a bit about talking about pronatalism. And that is that it is a fact, and it is a fact that is proven also with data, that having children is disproportionately impactful to women. We have a lot of data about like how women who have children, they experience like a majority of the gender wage gap, as Claudia Goldin, who won the Nobel Prize in 2023, points out, is due to motherhood. So, and if you look at educated women, they are particularly likely to delay having children, and then they try to catch up in their late 30s, but we all know that there is a biological, very big biological barrier to like having children. Even for many women, for like 20% of women, they struggle to have children in their late 30s. And I think that this, and the other thing is one's 30s are particularly important for career growth, especially high-powered careers. If you think about lawyers, investment bankers, scientists, anyone, that's when most growth happens. And even if women, after they have children, even if they start to up their hours again, that critical time that was lost, you never get it back. And it is a truth. So I think that makes things very hard because it's just a really difficult trade-off. Now, I'm not going to say that like we can solve the totality of this trade-off, but I do believe that we have been under-considering the fact that there is stuff to do about helping women have children, take control of their fertility whenever they want to. So I have a lot of friends who maybe did PhDs, are on the academic ladder, had 2 kids in quick succession after they got a permanent position. Maybe they would have a third one in their 40s. But that's not available to very many people because it's just a natural limit of our fertility. And I think that in terms of like science, female reproductive health and female reproduction, I know has been incredibly underfunded, understudied. I think this is starting to change. So Melinda Gates recently announced a $1 billion investment in specifically on women's health. Science has really advanced a lot in the background despite sort of problems with funding. So for example, in mice, people have produced healthy mouse babies from eggs that were produced from the mice's skin cells. So then through this, you can basically, if that was doable in humans, you could basically have a child whenever you want to, because the uterus, so the main thing that makes women less fertile when they age is the egg quality, so to speak. Uterus can carry, so the uterus also ages, but it's much less of a problem. Women as late as their 70s were able to give birth. It's a bit of a extreme, but it shows that it's possible. So there are companies pursuing this kind of things, but obviously I think this has to become much more of a, in my opinion, much more of a thing that is funded and much more part of public discussions about what we can do about women's careers and so on. So that's kind of what I wanted to say.
And over to you, Aveek.
Great. So, hi everyone, I'm Aveek Bhattacharya. I am Research Director of the Social Market Foundation think tank. And maybe some of the people here work in think tanks, so you may be familiar with them, but honestly, a lot of what you're trying to do in a think tank is trying to scope out issues that people are going to be talking about in a couple of years, in 3 years, 5 years time, and plant your flag in it. And so the reason I'm on this panel is because in 2021, just about 3 years ago, I wrote a paper about making the liberal case for pronatalism and looking at other countries, seeing that in many other countries, as France has a 100-year head start on the UK, and looking ahead and seeing that looking at the demographic challenges, looking at the economic challenges, the fiscal challenges, and saying this is a topic whose time has not come but will come. And the comments from Keir Starmer suggest that we're quite far from there yet. But the fact we're here having this conversation now suggests that, I knew a little something when I put that bet down. And I think that gives me encouragement that it's likely to keep growing in the years ahead. So I was asked to say a few words on the kind of the topic, the framing that we have. And I feel a bit ambivalent about, this is a bit of an awkward thing to say given your whole organization is called Boom, but I feel a bit ambivalent about the baby boom framing, right? Because I think part of the difficulty with this topic is that people get anchored on the replacement rate, 2.1 children per woman, which would get us to 100 grandchildren for 100 parents. And if you're paying attention to Phoebe's numbers, you'll see that France is quite far even from 100, despite being probably the poster child for success. And for promising a baby boom, then there's a risk that we get so far ahead of ourselves that we only get disappointment, and that fatalism and pessimism is allowed to grow. And that would be a real shame, because as Phoebe started to illustrate, but we can give many more examples. It's not just France. We can look closer to home. We can look at Gordon Brown's mini baby boom with tax credits when New Labour were in power. We can look at Australia and its baby bonuses. We can look at Norway and childcare, Austria and parental leave. All of these are countries that have put in policies that make parenthood easier or more affordable and have seen increases in birth rates as a result. And if we get fixated on we've got to fix the problem and get to 2.1, then we miss the fact that that is a success for every family that is allowed to fulfill their ambitions as a result. And the fact that those economic, those fiscal challenges, those social challenges get easier as we get closer, even if we don't quite hit 100 grandchildren for every potential grandparent. Now it is doable, but as Phoebe kind of hinted, it is not cheap. As a rough kind of rule of thumb, if we increase a household income by 3 to 4%, we can expect a 1% increase in fertility rate, so household income for potential parents. So quick back of an envelope, this is very rough, but I think this is inevitably going to be approximate. So I think if we did a £1,000 baby bonus in the UK, that'll be about £650 million. That would increase the birth rate about 1%. So that's the sort of order of magnitude. 3.5% of GDP will be what, 70 billion-ish? Again, don't know France's GDP off the top of my head, but I'll give you rough order of magnitude. And so I think this has two implications. The first thing is this is a kind of multi-government project. This is not going to be a quick fix. This is going to have to be lots of long-term policies. And the second thing, which I think is less obvious, but I think there is some kind of evidence to support, is that to squeeze the bang for buck for every pound that we spend, you really need to kind of support these, you need a multiplier effect, which will come from some of the cultural stuff that Ruxandra was starting to talk about, which is to say that it's not just enough to have the policies. If you have the supportive culture and if there's a reinforcing effect, then you're more likely to get the effects that we want, the consequences that we want, without having to spend quite as much as it might otherwise cost. And I think the implication of this is that this really needs to be cross-ideological, cross-party, if this is to be a kind of multi-decade project, in the way that France has been, and I think that's part of the model there. And I think if I'm looking at, I think we can kind of learn a lot by looking at the US presidential election right now, looking at the vice presidential candidates. Because if we look at the Republican vice presidential candidate, we've got J.D. Vance, an avowed pronatalist, who I think is in some ways the worst messenger you could have for pronatalism, as someone who has the vibe of wanting to control women's bodies, who kind of gives off sets off all the triggers that people who are not disposed to be sympathetic to the cause are likely to be kind of on guard against. And then on the other side, you have Tim Walz, who is kind of squeamish about saying it out loud, although in the vice presidential debate last week, he did talk about the value of allowing families or helping families who want to have children to be able to do so. But who couches his rhetoric, and when he was governor of Minnesota, set out the objective of making Minnesota the best state in the union to raise a family, who expanded child tax credits, who expanded free school meals, who had a kind of very explicitly pro-family agenda. And I think that's progress. I think that's helpful. I think that is more likely to be effective. And I think really the ideal synthesis is the kind of explicit goal and the willingness to say that more births is a good thing that you get from J.D. Vance, and the messaging and the policy and the delivery, frankly, of Tim Walz. And I think that's a real objective, is to, the risk here is that we talk about this, but we talk about it in a very ideologically homogenous space that risks off-putting many of the people, well, the women, frankly, that we want to encourage to have children or support to have children. And the messaging has to be careful, and it has to come from the right quarters and has to be couched in the right way. So I think that's a real task, is not just how do we do this, but how do we do this in the way that brings enough people from enough kind of sides of the ideological spectrum together.
Thank you. I just had a few questions, but please already start thinking about your questions. We're going to go to the floor relatively quickly. But just first to you, Phoebe, because you mentioned France as this kind of great example, but actually a lot of the countries that I guess are popularly associated with pronatalist policies, there seems to be actually quite mixed evidence. You know, people think of countries in Eastern Europe, for example, and it'd be interesting to know your thoughts about that. Or for example, Japan. A lot of people talk about Japan as almost facing an existential crisis. I think their political leader actually did mention that, and have argued that they've done a lot of different things, but that hasn't necessarily worked. So is the France example quite unique to France, or what can we pull from that, given that there are lots of different things that have been tried in lots of different countries, and it doesn't, what's the kind of mixed picture there?
I think an interesting one to get down into. So I'll talk about Japan and South Korea. And then also just quickly on the Nordics, because I think this is a good example of, in fact, I'll start there. You know, people often talk about Nordic countries, particularly Norway, but also Finland and Sweden. You know, the Nordics in general have good family policy, right? And they had an elevated birth rate for a long time. And you can see when they introduced their generous family policies in the 60s, 70s, you can see their fertility go up. And that wasn't introduced for any kind of like birth ideological reason, anything like that. It's just sort of, there was a consensus that this is how they wanted to build their family policy. Now, those countries have had falls in fertility, particularly over the past 10 years. So What appears to have happened there is that that Nordic family model is still really important in terms of getting to second, third, fourth births. And there's really good evidence that it works, and it makes it easier for people to expand their families. But where it's no longer really being effective is in terms of helping people to transition to parenthood, to have that first child. And there's been a demographer in London this week, a Finnish demographer, who's been talking about this and explaining, called Anna Rotkirk, whose work is extremely interesting. And she would say, if she was here, the Nordic family model works. It means that people have larger families. It supports families, but we need more as well. We need to do something to help people transition to parenthood. And that's what we're seeing in the Nordics. We are, of course, behind. Like, our family policy is not like the Nordics. So arguably for us, there's like a lot of low-hanging fruit there. In terms of Japan and South Korea, often spoken about slightly together in this, I think there are similarities between them. Both very low birth rate countries, so South Korea's birth rate is significantly lower than Japan's. Japan hasn't had particularly concerted perinatal policy, nor has it spent very much on its policy over the past 20 years or so. I don't think that we can look at Japan and say, this is a country that's tried everything and sadly it hasn't worked. That's just not the case. South Korea is a good example of that as well. People often say South Korea spent a lot of money, nothing's happened. Only really in the past 2 years or so has South Korea begun spending as much on family benefits as France. South Korea had an antenatalist program from 1960 to 1995, one of the world's most powerful, most successful antenatalist programs ever seen. They literally only got rid of it in 1995, despite having had quite a low birth rate for quite a long time at that point. They only began to introduce pro-family policies in 2005, and lots of those were like, $200 if you have a baby? Like, not very impressive stuff. In the past 2 years, they've really upped their game, but again, I don't think we can say this is a country that's tried a lot and nothing's worked.
Interesting. Ruxandra, it was interesting that you were saying that, the role of science and, for example, other things related to using skin cells to have babies. Obviously, this is quite futuristic for a lot of people. But in a way, it made me think that, I guess you're almost accepting the frame then that it's fine to delay, because you're essentially saying that actually, we should accept the frame that people should pursue their career first, and then, have children later. Whereas I think some other people might, that make the case for pro-natalist policies, actually saying that we should be thinking about that we shouldn't be so worried about doing those things together. Whereas it sounded like you're almost saying that we should move towards a situation or be more open to a situation where actually people delay it and focus on career, self-actualization, etc. first?
Yeah, so I think that's a very good question. And I think I didn't really quite have time in the initial in my speech to address this. But actually, I wrote an article yesterday for CapEx, people can check it out, where I kind of addressed the fact that there is almost some people are arguing that the sort of very individualistic sort of philosophy that kind of emerged post-Enlightenment, so basically liberalism, is kind of at odds with motherhood itself, because motherhood will always involve some sort of sacrifice, and by trying to maximize both sort of self-fulfillment and self-actualization and freedom, and also having children is just not really compatible. So I think there is I do think that you identify a very good tension here, right? So should we just, is basically saying that, we should just push for more optionality, just going against what I said, which is that maybe we should encourage people to value children more. I think I have a few, answers to that. So first of all, I'm very biased, I like liberalism. I don't think we're going back on a lot of, and I think when saying that we should become much less individualistic, even if we were to achieve that, I know a lot of people are saying be more communitarian, I think I do believe that, and I think Deirdre McCloskey, who is an economic historian, talks a lot about how the so-called Great Betterment, or the sort of rise in technological progress, was in large part a result of adoption of these more sort of liberal ideologies. And I'm very worried that if we became a very communitarian culture, maybe there is room to become much more communitarian, but I'm worried that it would come with a lot of other trade-offs. Now, I think on the sort of, and then the second point that I want to make is that I think that it varies a lot by woman, right? So it depends a lot on why I think different types of women and different types of families have different reasons to not have children or have less than ideal. So for example, Phoebe mentioned Anna Rotkirch, I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. She makes the point that, for example, in Finland, it's actually low-income people who are having less children. And that's because of the fact that it's not necessarily because they want to pursue this super high-powered career and all be lawyers. It's because they literally can't get by. And they just can't, literally have, they feel like they can't even have the ability to start a family. But then you'll also, I think, always have, unless you really suppress women's rights, I think you always have certain women who are interested in succeeding in these domains. I don't really think you can suppress that. And I think that maybe, as Aveek said, maybe science could help sort of decouple the idea of these men in these rooms that don't want women to work and so on because they want them to have children from pronatalism. So maybe you can be like, hey, look, you can actually choose your timelines. And also these timelines are at the moment really restrictive for a lot of women. It's not just like some women can't even struggle to have babies even when they're 35, 36. So we're not talking here, and we don't know which women. That's another problem. We can't predict which ones. So, yeah, that was a very long answer, and I think, but that's my answer.
I wanted to get quite specific on something. I wanted to know your thoughts, Aveek, because obviously this is bringing it to some of the debates that are happening now. So, for example, the two-child benefit cap, that's obviously like a controversial issue. And a lot of people would say that they do support families and do it in principle. I'm talking about ordinary people, but that is obviously something that generally speaking people are quite supportive of, the idea, the two-child benefit cap, even if there's a lot of campaigners. So what do you think about that? Because I think maybe some people might make the argument that that there is this sense in society that people shouldn't have kids that they can't afford, or that people feel like, well, they're struggling, so why should we be paying for people? What do you think of that issue?
Yeah, really great question. Can I have a couple of words on Ruxandra's one first? Because I thought it was, fascinating. I'm also pretty partial to liberalism. I don't know if we can throw it out even if we wanted to. But to make that, I think it's much more concrete. And before you get to sci-fi stuff, this trade-off, I think basically obtains with relation to IVF. So the evidence we have of expansions of IVF is that they haven't been particularly effective at increasing birth rates, because women basically delay, and that nets out, it comes out in the wash as basically neutral. But I'd be inclined to say that's still a good thing. I think funding fertility treatment is still good, because giving women autonomy, giving families autonomy over their reproduction is valuable in itself. So there might be a trade-off between this macro total number of births versus wanted children at the right time for families. So that was just on Ruxandra's question. On your question, Anaya, about the two-child limit, I think there's a couple of things going on. So the really kind of ugly thing there is we want children, but we don't want the wrong sorts of children, which is the sort of, we've got this far, and Phoebe will probably kill me for even saying the word, but eugenics hovers over this conversation. And I think we kind of need to confront it and say that that is not what we're talking about. If this is to be effective, it is to say that it is not about the wrong sorts of children. It is not about skin color. It is not about cultural background. It is not about even income. And to say that children are valuable wherever they come about. So I think that's one side of it. I think the other reality is that often most people are not that committed to family policy in the UK, and getting that over the line, getting the kind of repeal of the two-child limit over the line, just purely in terms of child poverty, has been such a struggle that it tells us something about how much we value families in the orthodox centre-left social democratic lens, even let alone from the perspective of birth rates.
Did you want to come back on anything? I have a few more questions, but I want to take it out to the floor.
No, I think let's go to everybody.
Cool. Hands up then, if you have questions. Okay, fantastic. Lots of questions. We'll take the gentleman right at the front, and we'll take a few questions at a time.
Bismarck analysis. What do the panel think about my favourite policy for this, which is And admittedly, this only works for graduates. We've got to do something else, obviously, for non-graduates. But we cut people's student loan balances by 20, 25,000, whatever it is, for each kid they have. And then if they have 3 or more, whether for their third kid above the, once they were above replacement, then we cancel the whole loan balance and we refund them any, interest payments we've made to date. Which, I know this sounds really dumb, but the world is dumb. It does come with the hidden advantage that for the Treasury, this mostly does not involve any upfront costs. Most of it is just foregone future revenue, which in our very cash-constrained fiscal environment could be construed as an advantage. Also, Aveek, you didn't mention the Soviet Union as a great example of effective family policy, which it was, and in a good and relatively non-coercive way. Come on, you're a left-wing guy.
Okay, we'll take a few questions at a time. The lady over here.
Thanks for the great talk so far. I was kind of wondering on the culture stuff, what nobody has really been talking about so far is kind of what is the culture of parenting that we currently have. And I feel like I hear a lot about it's just gotten so much harder, there's so much higher standards, there are all these mom groups and there's the word mom shaming, and it's just it really feels kind of less a fun thing, right? If it's just you have to do all these things exactly right, and there's these different types of parenting that you can do. And I don't know, I guess there's also some empirical evidence on you get these more intensive parenting styles when there's more inequality, because then it basically there's a higher payoff to if your child does really well. I'm kind of wondering whether you guys have any takes on what we could do about that to just make parenting more fun and less oh my God, I have to do all these things.
Yeah, we'll just take one more, then we'll bring it back out to the guy behind you. Yeah.
Thanks very much, everybody. Most of the focus so far has been on strategies which the government could use to encourage people who already want to have children to do so. And I was just wondering about policies to persuade people to consider having children. Obviously, there might be philosophical objections to going down that route, but I was wondering whether anyone is aware of any evidence whether that works or has been tried anywhere, kind of more persuasive strategies.
Thank you. So we had obviously the question about strategies, other incentives, student loan cancellation, and are we making it too hard to be a parent, just in what we're telling people? Would you like to pick up first, Phoebe?
Sure. So for the gentleman from Bismarck Analysis, cutting people's student loan balances when they have children, I do think that policies that I think that policies that very clearly signal to people, we appreciate that you are having children, we appreciate that it's difficult, and we're here to support you because we value it, are vital. I think that there is a danger perhaps in some policies that people might find them it's in a similar way that policies that blatantly attempt to incentivize marriage are very unpopular, right? Because people don't feel like that's something they want to be financially incentivized with. So I think there's something around showing people very clearly, we care about what you're doing, we want to support you, and also not making people feel like they're being paid to have a baby. But perhaps cutting people's student loans is something that actually people would say, that's very positive. I am indeed doing something that is not only me and my family, but is of a benefit for us all, and it's a direct benefit that I'm now, the state is making things easier for me as a result. So maybe. I'm not sure
if there's a value-neutral way of saying this, but it feels quite Orban. What do you think? Which is in both Orban, Hungary, in that both with the kind of socio-cultural kind of freightage of that, but more of it just complicated, more elaborate than...
It may be that non-means tested child benefit is a more obvious way forward here, a much more generous non-means tested child benefit. Child tax allowance.
We'll come back to other points. But
this lady's question about resource-intensive parenting, I think it's a really big problem, and it's one of those things that once it takes hold, it's really tricky. I read an article 2 weeks ago or something about resource-intensive parenting, how bad it is, and it listed all these products, showed look at what we're lobbying parents to buy, including a little sock that goes on baby's foot and beeps if their heart rate goes too low and costs £300. And I was shaking my head judgmentally as I Googled the reviews that I am going to get it. And this is a really good example of how people, parents are bombarded with all sorts of expectations. And that can be products, but also the idea, for example, that you are you as a parent, you are absolutely responsible for your child's mental health, even when they're in their 20s and 30s and things like that. And that's a tremendous burden. It's also obviously facilitated by smaller family sizes, because when you have a smaller family, you can more easily spend more time you can invest your resources more easily on that smaller number of children. But it also then sort of feeds a smaller family habit as well, because that's what everyone else is doing, and that's what you learn what being a good parent is. I think I'm actually really not sure how you fight against it. I think having many more frank conversations, making it easier for people to start their families younger when their resources are a bit more limited, making it easier for people to have more children so it actually becomes less possible, is potentially the way forward. But I'm extremely interested generally in people's thoughts about how you can fight resource-intensive parenting. In terms of people who, sorry, I don't know if you wanted me to go through each question.
No,
like this.
I mean, just pick the ones that you, other panelists can also jump in,
Yeah, so obviously the one that I thought was most relevant to me was the one about like intensive parenting, and I think that's a huge problem. Obviously, I didn't really have time to address it. Phoebe said that she doesn't think there are solutions. I mean, yeah, it's very hard to think of a solution. So first of all, I agree it's a really big problem. The other, like a week ago, I don't usually watch TikTok, but like randomly I was watching TikTok. No, for real. I'm too busy with Twitter to also have time for TikTok, you know? So anyway, so there was this woman who was saying, she was a lawyer, and she was saying that she feels very guilted. She feels very guilted by other mothers at her school, because a lot of other mothers are stay-at-home mothers, and they always arrange a lot of these extracurricular activities during the workday. And my understanding is that there are specifically these like fancy schools where kids like are enrolled in like 300 different extracurricular activities, and mothers have this pressure to like you have to go to tennis lessons and blah, 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 blah. And my opinion on that is that this is very noxious. And I think it's very like, I wonder how much of the fact that women who have careers find it harder is just because there's this pressure to do all this stuff, especially in upper middle class families. My group of friends, a lot of us are Brian Kaplan pilled. So they said that, so he has a book, Brian Kaplan has a book, which I don't know I forget his name. Yes, exactly. Selfish reasons. Look, so he marries individualism and liberalism with pronatalism. So there is a way. So he has a book called Selfish Reasons to Have Kids. So the thing is, and I totally agree with him, I think obviously, I don't totally agree with him. I think parenting has a role, but I think it's more an advisory role. I think kids have their natural inclinations and natural talents and natural interests, and I think it's better to foster them. I would literally bet a lot of money that sending your kids to like 300 different extracurriculars that they're not even interested in, or like freaking out about like whether the pillow that they sleep on is like hypoallergenic in like 300 different ways. I am 100% certain that doesn't have any impact on the long-term outcomes of children. So actually, maybe Brian Kaplan pilling more people, but without Brian Kaplan, who has a lot of aesthetics that are in many ways. I love Brian Kaplan. I love everyone at George Mason. I think they're great. But let's be honest, they're not the kind of people that will switch women, especially women who are the ones that feel understandably so more attacked by these things. They're not the ones that are going to switch women over. So I think we need women who talk about how, it's silly that we do this. Yeah, anyway.
Did you want to come back on anything, Aveek?
Yeah, I mean, maybe is Brian Kaplan without Brian Kaplan in this context Jonathan Haidt? Because, yeah, I mean, I think when Ruxandra, the thing that you said in your initial contribution, or when you talked about Anna Rotkirk and you were talking about poor people in Finland can't afford to have kids. And there's a bit of me that says, really, compared to 30 years ago, poor people in Finland?
Yeah, I'm falling into that trap.
But and the point is, it's because of societal expectations of what you need to be a decent parent. And I think I'm a little bit, this is speculative, but I wonder if we're reaching a bit of an inflection point about about intensive parenting. And I wonder if phones is the kind of way that's going to come in. So if you've read The Anxious Generation, the first couple of chapters of that are not about phones. They're about how parenting became more intensive, about the negative effects it's had on children. And I think that this will change through social mores. This is a very speculative prediction. I think it's quite hard to do through policy or anything like that, but I think there are reads in the air that suggest that the wind might be changing. We didn't answer this gentleman's question. I think the really simple answer is that if you ask people how many children they want, it's well enough about fertility, above replacement rate, that you don't really need to be worrying with that. It's 2.3, 2.4, you did the most recent survey.
2.35 for women of childbearing age.
Yeah. So why would you when there's that reservoir to pick?
Thank you. Okay, so we'll take another round of questions. Put your hand up. We'll take one from this side.
Thank you. Housing theory of everything. If we took people in their 20s and 30s from spending a third to a half of their income on housing to spending a quarter or a fifth, and took them from in their 20s and into their 30s being in a flat share to being in a home where they are stable and have space for a baby nursery, for instance, how far do you think that could take us without the need for explicit government transfer?
Thank you. Sorry, Brian. I think this guy over there at the back.
Thanks. I think some kind of klaxon goes off when someone mentions housing as the solution at a think tank policy event. My question was going to be, I think if you poll women and ask them why they aren't having children, the top answer is because they can't find the right partner. So to what extent are we talking a bit too much about women's preferences and not enough about our expectations of men, outcomes for boys and men through the schooling system? And I think we talked a little bit about paternity leave, but good to surface some of that stuff, I think. What do you think about that?
Very interesting question. Manira, I think you had a question. Oh, okay. The guy behind you.
Firstly, thank you to all the speakers on the panel. I was very struck listening to Phoebe's comments about how diametrically opposed the policies she mentioned seem to be to the general direction of policy in this country under the successive Conservative government since 2010, and indeed to the comments just the other week of Conservative leadership contender Kemi Badenoch. So my question is, firstly, I would like to ask each of the panel, how much damage do you think the Conservative governments between 2010 and 2024 did to Britain's demographic future? And secondly, is the Conservative Party an existential threat to Britain's birth rate going forward?
Okay, thank you for that. So we had a question about housing, about the role of men, which I thought was a very good question, and then the role of the Conservative Party. Aveek, I think maybe you can start.
I'll do housing and I'll do the Conservatives. Yeah, on housing, I think it's directionally helpful, but the really simple answer actually to both those questions is to say this is not a uniquely British problem. And in some ways, Britain is, certainly from a policy discourse perspective, Britain is quite far behind. In terms of raw numbers, it's often comparable. So there are countries with less dysfunctional housing markets that have kind of similar levels of problem. It's very crude, bivariate correlation, looking at it that way. And the evidence, I think, specific on the micro evidence, is quite complicated, and even about the housing that you need, what sort of housing at what stage. So is it about getting young people out of the parental homes so that they can pair up? Is it about space? How does that interact with expectations? Now, all of this is to say, I think if we had more effective housing policy, more houses, that would be directionally good. But I don't think it's a silver bullet. I think so. Your question is, how far does it get us? It helps, but I think that there's other policies that are probably more effective, and it doesn't get you out of the jam, if you want to think of it that way. On the Conservatives, I said other countries generally. What does it say that Scotland has a lower fertility rate? Maybe it says that the SNP couldn't do all the wonderful things they wanted to do because the Conservatives stopped them. I think it's fair to say the Conservatives have not been helpful, but I think there's still plenty of opportunity to reverse that. But as I say, a lot depends on, and I think in some ways, if the Conservatives had been explicitly pro-natalist, that might have been short-term good and long-term bad, depending on how they framed it. Depends which Conservatives, depend what sort of framing. So short answer is it's complicated. It's maybe fractions of beyond the decimal point.
On housing, agree with Aveek that it's not a silver bullet, but do think that it could really matter a lot. I think in terms of family formation particularly, you're not going to, if you're 27 or 28 and you're living at home with your parents, you aren't going to have a child. And I do think it could make quite a significant difference, though it is surprisingly difficult to pin down the evidence because of the way that people move and how they respond to housing crises. So, but I think it's one of those things that's intuitive and probably would actually help really quite a lot. In terms of fathers, I don't think we talk enough about men in this policy area. Very often I find that the people who are working on it or who are going to roundtables and on panels are women. But there are an increasing number of people, including men. We even have a man. Unfortunately, one of our men did drop out. And I think that people do spend, I was struck by this myself a few months ago, thinking about all the time I spent thinking about like what makes a woman feel, yes, I'm ready to have a child. Yes, I would really like to be a mother. And actually, I just realized I haven't really asked myself that question very much about men. So it's been a hole in my own thinking and something that I think we all generally, people who work in this policy area, need to do better on. In terms of the damage that the Tory government has done to family policy has not been a political priority in this country for a long time. The Conservatives have just sort of been emblematic of that. I think in some ways they're now showing that they're more willing to talk about it more directly than the left of centre is. But basically it's been bad across the board, I think. And certainly we can point to policies over the past decade that have absolutely not been helpful.
Except for Gordon.
Except for Gordon Brown and his 45,000 strong baby boom, yes.
Yeah, so I just wanted to talk about the role of men, and I think it's totally right that relationship formation is upstream of having children, and we have seen actual drops in relationship formation, and I'm kind of worried about, I think culture also plays a role here, and I'm kind of worried in general about like the relationship between the sexes. I actually had this article that I wrote for my Substack in which I discussed about the fact that I see almost like, especially on the internet, like a polarization between men and women. And you can see that in like increased political polarization, but it's not, and this polarization is not mostly based on like super concrete policy ideas, it's more based on vibes and sort of aesthetics. So I think that that's very noxious. So I think that, I think dating apps, I know I sound like a grandmother, but like, I think in my opinion, there is something a bit suspicious about dating culture at the moment, and I see it particularly in younger people. It just, I don't know, there just seems to be like something. Maybe again, I'm like a grandmother, but like I do feel like people are just very risk averse. Like there's less coupling, and I think this goes back to Jonathan Haidt. So Jonathan Haidt. We try to make, you see that in teenagers as well. Teenagers are having less sex, drinking less, just being less like naughty. And like we wanted this. We said like, this is great. We want like 30 years ago, it would have been like, this is great. We don't want our teenagers to have sex. But like now we're having a problem that they don't. And that's a problem. No, I'm serious. Like I don't want to sound weird, but it's real. And Jonathan Haidt actually talks about this, which is that we have basically raised people into this like safetyist, very anxious culture. And what does like still like men usually have, even in today's society, often have to make the first move. But if people are like, but even if they don't have to make the first move, everyone is just anxious. Everyone is afraid. People don't want to like approach each other. And yes, I think it comes down to like a general anxietification of society. I think it comes down to what Jonathan Haidt was speaking about, how we are coddling teenagers. And if you're a teenager that didn't meet the opposite sex, then you're going to be more likely to maybe find it harder in your 20s to meet the opposite sex. So just to summarize, I think there are a lot of problems, but I don't have any concrete idea about how you actually switch that, apart from talking about it and saying like, hey, this is not okay. Teenagers should do more things, Yeah.
If you also have like some thoughts, so questions as well as some thoughts is actually also welcome, because it seems like there's a lot of interesting people in the audience. So this gentleman over here.
One of the few, maybe only post-industrial countries where the secular population has fertility above replacement rate is Israel. Is Israel a special case, or are there lessons to be learned from it?
The lady at the back there.
Thanks. At the moment, pronatalism as a kind of political movement or policy interest has very right-wing vibes. Is that alienating to people who want to actually advance these policy goals? And if so, how do you change it to be more cross-party?
Cool. This guy there.
Thanks very much. Very good panel. As a representative of the Luddite Union, I am very concerned about technology. And especially the technology you were mentioning that would allow people to have children at a later age. I think often there is this perception, because it's possible for men, if they have a child late on, people think it's selfish, people think it's not very good form, because you will die when your child will still be quite young. And if we allow the average age of people at which people have children to shift too far in the kind of high age direction, I'm worried that the structure of family formation, the structure of the demographic structure of society will change, and this will have drastic consequences for culture and etc. Do you have any thoughts about this?
Yeah, we'll take a couple more. There's a guy right at the back there.
And this actually kind of follows the previous point slightly, and as you said, you touched somewhat on the point about age of childbirth, and that you're talking a lot about fertility per woman. As far as I can tell, the numbers you're putting out seem to be fertility per woman numbers, but a lot of demographic change can be drastically affected by age when having children. For example, if there's a 10-year difference between the average age of having children, then you're going to have a lot more people in a shorter period if the age is lower. So how do we deal with that? I don't really know. I think it maybe also feeds into the question about men, again, because there was something doing the rounds on Twitter at some point recently about the problem of sort of forever boyfriends. Again, that you have sort of a whole collection of couples, relationships where they've been together, 5-6 years, they're in their late 20s, early 30s, and still, despite it all, the onus is sort of on men to propose and to kind of push things forward in that area. So then how do we come to a point where people either realize they don't want the long-term thing and children, or else sort of take the leap, I guess. And then that's the anxietification.
Yeah, there was a lady just right next to you. I think might as well take a question, yeah.
Thank you. Also, semi-related to this gentleman's point, because alarm bells were ringing for me when I heard about these mice studies, because it implies that a woman's biological clock is a problem to be solved, and I wouldn't agree with that. I think one of the problems is that career trajectories and the job market is geared towards a male default, and I think that is something that we should be looking into. I work for The Other Half, and we've just written a report on what mums want in the early years, and what overwhelmingly they told us is that they actually do want to have career breaks and flexible working, especially when their children are young. And I was wondering if you had any solutions to the cultural and economic problem that women are only being offered the solution of childcare at the minute, and that is overwhelmingly what we were told they don't want. That doesn't make them feel supported as parents. So I was wondering if you had any suggestions about how we can support parents to spend time with their children in the early years.
Yeah, so question about Israel. Does natalism still have the right-wing vibes? Question about technology. And on that point, I'm quite interested in that question as well about, do we need to normalise maybe, on-ramps and off-ramps when it comes to like female careers and career breaks, as was mentioned, where it doesn't have to just be one route, and if you don't pursue that, then you're a failure, and if you do pursue that, then you're not willing to take certain sacrifices. Maybe there's just something different that needs to be thought of. So I think I'm interested in that point as well. We'll start with Ruxandra this time.
Thank you. Yeah, so actually regarding the on-ramp and off-ramp there's actually this fellowship at my institute. It's called the Janet Thornton Fellowship, named after like a famous female scientist. And basically it's geared towards women who have been out of, have taken career breaks, maybe for family formation reasons, and helping them sort of reintegrate into research life, which can be quite challenging if you've been away from science for 5 years or more. So I'm totally on board on that. But we also need to be realistic because cognitive flexibility doesn't last forever. Ability to do work doesn't last forever. And there seems to be And let's say someone already takes breaks into their 30s, right? And maybe they want one more baby. I think it makes a very big difference, no matter how family-friendly policies are, whether you have 3 or 2 children in your 30s, where you take 7 years off, or whether you take 3 years off, right? So I believe that given that, you know, you're not going to be as sort of capable of being, like, it does seem like if you look at when people perform their best work, it's for which they win the Nobel Prize and everything, it does seem to happen mostly in their 30s, because I think you hit this like sort of sweet point between, it is true that part of it is because careers are designed for men, but it's also true it's because I think you hit a sweet point between having accumulated experience, but still having the cognitive flexibility to produce very high quality work. So in my opinion, yes, by all means, you know, I'm really on board with this, like Janet Thornton Fellowship. I think it's a great idea. But let's say a woman who is a scientist wants to have 3 kids. I think no matter how many fellowships there are and no matter how things there are, I think her being able to have children in her 40s is going to make a meaningful impact in her decision to switch from 2 to 3. Yeah. And I also want to talk a bit about the age one. And like whether it's okay to have like a shift in the age of parents. Well, I don't think, I mean, you know, things change with time. I think we're not really talking here about people having children in their 70s, right? We're talking here about like a lot of women still can have children in their late 30s or in their early 40s. It's not like unheard of. It's just that you never know whether you're going to be one of the lucky ones. So it's not like I don't even perceive it as something that's like fundamentally so unnatural. It's just that at the moment, we don't really have any good predictive models for which women will be able to have a child when they're 40 and which women won't. And I think it's very tragic to me that there are women who are maybe 38 and they want to have babies and they can't, like 20% of women, or like, you know, in that range. So to me, expanding their opportunity, I think people, and the men thing is real, like men can have children even later on and they still, most men don't, I mean, you have Robert De Niro or whoever else, but like most men don't go around having children at 80. I think, I very much doubt that, you know, suddenly women will switch to having children when they're 75. So that's kind of my answer to that.
Yeah, maybe the Israel point.
Yes, on Israel, there's lots of fascinating things about Israel to pick up here. But one I think that's particularly worth mentioning is Israel's culture of allo-parenting. So essentially that lots of people very luckily, and again, we can talk about the housing crisis again here, live quite close to their extended families. And that means whether you're secular or religious, and that means that they get support with their children from their own parents, from their siblings, from their cousins. Because it does make a big difference, you know, even if you are a 2-parent household, and of course many people are single-parent households, it makes a big difference having that person to call and say, please, could you pick them up? Please, could you come over and watch them? My sister-in-law drove me to my maternity appointment yesterday. That's exactly the kind of support that women need, that fathers need as well. And I think that's a way in which, you know, Ruxandra's been talking about culture. That's a way in which we can all kind of influence culture and make culture more pro-parenting and more supportive for those who have children as well. I was speaking to a policy person recently whose sister has 2 small children, and he's a single man, he's 28, he loves his niece and nephew, he goes and he looks after them for one evening once a week. That's something that like literally like we can do if you luckily live near your family, and actually makes a real difference to people and makes being a parent like tangibly much easier. And yes, just quickly on the point that a couple of people have made about rigid life paths. And I'm really actually, you also put it very strongly, Anaya. Very, very rigid life paths. You first have to go to university for this amount of time, and then you have to do this, and then you'll have to get to this point in your career, and then maybe when you're at that point in your career, then you can start thinking about having a child. I think what Ruxandra says about extending the age at which people can have children is very important, but it's also about bringing that down a bit and making it easier for those who say, actually, I'm 25 and 26, me and my partner, we'd like to have our child now. Like, how can we make that more supportive with off-ramps? I think that's something practical and actually probably not very difficult to do.
And do you want to pick up the right wing?
I do, yeah. So, I mean, It's somewhat contingent, and it's somewhat. I think in more countries it probably is more associated with the right than the left. But to Phoebe's point about the Nordic countries, most of them have quite strong social democratic traditions. Anna Rotkirk, who's been mentioned a couple of times, she was appointed demographic czar. Do you remember what her title was? But it was Sanna Marin, who is definitely social democratic, who was the Finnish prime minister who engaged her to work on that. So it doesn't have to be this way. And if you look at the arguments, I don't think there's anything fundamentally right-wing about thinking that people who want to have children should have more children. If you look at the voting patterns, having young people is probably more in the interest of the left than it is in the right. Having a gerontocracy is probably working better for the Conservatives than it is for the left and centre-left at the moment. And there's kind of glimmers of this within our own politics. So Claire Ainsley, who for a little while was part of Keir Starmer's team. She wrote this book called The New Working Class, which is basically about what are the values that Labour needs to embrace, how can Labour reach out to the voters it needs to win. And one of her arguments was that family is one of these core values which Labour has seen as historically as not quite so strong on, but which unifies people across the voter coalition. So I think there's lots of material there to work with if the left wants to get on board, and I think there's lots of reasons why they should.
I had a question. I mean, is there a tension in the discussion with the family issue? Because there's also like a less mainstream but adjacent discussion about some people worried about like family breakdown and single parenthood and the particularly, in lower socioeconomic backgrounds and the kind of impact that might be having in socioeconomic outcomes. That's obviously debated, but there is that discussion. And there's also you're obviously saying that having babies is an intrinsic good and we should encourage more of that. Is there like a tension at all there? Is it that it doesn't matter in what form that takes, we should just encourage people to have kids? Because I think a lot of people are in good faith worried about family structure as an impact as well on socioeconomic outcomes. So,
yes, I think it actually might be interesting to hear your take then on family breakdown. It's obviously good that people can end and move away from relationships that are not working for them, but family breakdown is ultimately not good for the well-being of parents. Not good for sort of the wealth and the stability of the family, not great for the well-being of children, and also not great for birth rates. I think where people on the right of centre often slightly trip up here is that the conversation becomes really stuck about talking around marriage and how we keep families intact. And actually what I'd like to see is much more like policy discussion on how you practically support families to stay together. And I also think that the polling is pretty clear that the British people are really not very interested in policies that push marriage at them. As great as I think being a marriage is, and I really like being married, I'm not sure that people really want to feel that the government is kind of pushing them towards it. I think the way forward here is really thinking about how can we actually support families better and keep them together, and not just talking about marriage. But that's the conversation on the right, but on the left?
I think the social science conversation there's an implicit assumption there that the marginal children that are born are more likely to be, or disproportionately likely to be, at risk of family breakdown. And I don't know if that's true. Do you know, Phoebe?
Sorry, what was the...
So basically, the marginal children that are born are more likely to be born in families that are prone to breakdown, or I guess, I don't know, less wanted or less, whatever. There's lots of ways you can get there. It's empirically studyable. You can look at all these places that have had positive effects and see, has that led to, can we identify them as being more likely to be in broken families?
Yeah. Well, maybe that's something people need to look further into. Yeah. Okay, we'll take a final round of questions. So we'll probably just take as many and then the panel can pick up for what they want. So final round of questions. Guy in the middle there.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed this. A lot of the problems that you diagnose are cultural, and that implies the solutions are also cultural. And I'd be curious to what extent you think the government should or even has the ability to actually solve these problems. I mean, personally, I think it could go beyond the financial incentives. It controls the school curriculum. It has influence over the BBC. It can control who's a first and second class citizen through transport, healthcare priorities. I'd be curious if you think these are tools it should use.
So we'll take a final round. So there's the guy over here.
So it's linked to this guy's question as well. Like, if the problems are cultural, instead of trying to come up with policy solutions, should you not try and create a non-political cultural movement to change the status around having children?
Yeah. David Goodhart over there. Yeah. Oh.
Hello. I cover technology, and this is something that, for better or worse, and for want of a better term, tech bros have become quite interested in recently. Other than us all having a baby with Elon Musk, is there a practical thing that the technology industry could do here to help move things forward?
Thanks.
As you can tell, I'm a would-be leader of yesterday rather than tomorrow. But if I may ask a question or make an observation, leading on from what the woman, what's your organisation called? The Other Half, yeah. So is that one of the problems with our current debate is that it tends to be dominated by professional women who have a very strong interest in childcare, but not in what you might call the sort of broader world of domesticity, the kind of world that is described in the Other Half's document. A very large minority, if not a majority, of actual or would-be mothers want to stay at home when children are young, but the people who dominate the debate are women who are very work-focused. They also want to have children often, but they're very work-focused. So, and a good example of this was, I think it was the Conservative budget of 2023, at a time of very, very tight control of public spending. Jeremy Hunt announced a £4 billion expansion in childcare, and nobody batted an eyelid. And the reason he did that, I think, is because of the disproportionate influence in this debate of the kind of professional women that he is surrounded by, the people that he meets at his dinner parties, the MPs, and so on. And they are, to the extent they're pro-natalist in a very narrow way, and that has hugely affected the debate. They are a very important sort of hidden lobby in our society.
Thank you. Any last questions and comments?
Yeah, I just wanted to say a little bit about the dating stuff, because that has come up. And I guess that's something I have like personal experience of as someone who's like quite young, but like also wanted children quite young. And yeah, I don't know, I think there is just this thing where like it's kind of weird, right? Like it's really weird to go on dates and be like, hey, like this is what I want like children in the next few years, I want to get married. So yeah, I don't know, I do think that that's a problem, but then it's also really hard to say what the solution should be, right? Because like, I don't know, I guess I'm also very happy that I didn't marry my first boyfriend. And like, obviously, if you kind of like shifted cultural norms in this direction where like, yeah, you just like marry way younger and you decide way quicker, then you obviously also get a lot of cases where like that wasn't the right decision. And yeah, I just find it really hard to tell kind of which direction should we actually go in. Is it bad that dating culture has changed so much? Like they're just like really hard trade-offs here, right? So yeah.
Okay, so yeah, feel free to pick up and summarize and look to the future as well.
On the non-political cultural movement to make it easier to choose to have children, I don't remember who it was who said that, but can I just say, yes, please. That's really great. Like, government policy is only one part of this. That's also why I brought up the allo-parenting point. Like, thinking about how everyone can actually like work and contribute to a more pro-parent, pro-child culture. It's not necessarily about having children yourself. Talking about this issue, raising awareness, getting people to understand that there are things that we can all do, things that our leaders should be doing. I think that's really important. And just quickly on David's comment about whether or not the focus on childcare is just because the conversation is, as you say, like you said, I think dominated by professional women who are very interested in being able to get childcare so they can continue with their careers. I do think that actually probably a lot of it is just to do with like just treasury stuff actually. Like, this is to do with the fiscal incentives that the Treasury, we have a lot of economic capital concentrated in women of a childbearing age. I do think that among those women also, there is definitely appetite for policies that do just create more choice. I mean, for example, Tim Leunig, brilliant economist, was talking to me about, why don't we just give parents a liquid pot of money or credits which they can use to, and this is also something I think that you've been talking about, David, that they can use to either fund childcare so they can go to work, or they can use to spend some time at home. And so I think that there is, the Treasury, of course, would say dead weight loss, right, if you said that to them. But I think that sort of policy is something that we need to hear about more. I'll stop there.
Ruxandra?
Yeah, so someone said, what can technology do apart from everyone having babies with Elon Musk? So that would be very bad from like a scientific point of view, because we would really decrease genetic diversity, and that's why we have sexual reproduction in the first place. So if Elon Musk somehow clonally expands his genes into the population and takes over, that's really bad. And I don't think many scientists would endorse that. Not even tech bros, the ones that know about this stuff. Anyway, so leaving that aside, I think, so first of all, in order for Elon, I know that there is this like sort of perception that talking about technology and babies and so on is like a tech bro thing. But actually, first of all, for Elon Musk to have babies with a lot of women, he doesn't even need too much technology. Actually, men having babies with a lot of women is like a very old practice. Some might call trad, some might call right wing, some might call, like the Ottoman Empire harem. So like I don't see why it's associated with tech at all. There are many things that tech can do to help with birth stuff. Like, first of all, I just talked about Melinda Gates donating $1 billion to sort of women's health stuff. And women's health is like incredibly understudied. It's very hard to explain how understudied it is. I'm a professional scientist. If I want to look something about a type of cancer, very easy, a lot of results. If I want to find out about endometriosis, if I want to find out about all sorts of issues that I'm not even talking about extending fertility span beyond 40. I'm talking, or beyond 35 or whatever. I'm talking about like women who are infertile at the moment, even when they're 25, we don't know why. And it's because there are several reasons for this. So one of them is that it's super hard to study female reproductive health because our reproductive system, the human reproductive system, is very different, especially with females from, for example, mice, which are very useful. For example, mice don't menstruate in the same way women have. Mice don't have menopause. It's actually... humans are one of the very few species who has menopause. So you don't really have model organisms to study this. It has been super underinvested. So yes, there is a ton of stuff. Starting, not even talking about like fertility, about like extending reproductive span, just talking about like figuring out how to help women with polycystic ovary syndrome, endometriosis, and so on.
Thank you. And final comments from you, Aveek?
Shall I pick up on the culture and politics thing? I think so. A theme is that probably liberalism's still going to survive, which I think makes it difficult, which kind of puts restrictions on how much cultural pressure. I think in the kind of decades ahead, it's going to be really fascinating to see how China confronts the demographic challenge, because I think that in some ways is like the edge case of what governments are willing to do. But there are a whole host of things that the Chinese government does that the UK government would never do, would hopefully never do, and which, are not going to be within the Overton window of what the UK government seeks to do. I think that so I think there's a limit to kind of how much cultural pressure the government is likely to be exerting. Having said that, I think there is a kind of reciprocal relationship between culture and policy. So the government can do the policy, and then hopefully the culture follows and kind of reinforces, as I said right at the start. And more than that, I think there's a temptation often, I think particularly probably on the left, to say, look, we'll do the nice stuff, and that will lead to the babies, and we don't need to talk about it. It'll just kind of happen. And to some extent that works, but it will be more effective if you say, it would be better if we kind of valued children as a society, if we made it easier for people to have the children that they want. I think that will be supportive, that will have the multiplier effect on the policy, and then both your policy and your culture are pushing in the same direction.
Thank you. Can we give our panel a round of applause?